Good morning, everybody. I'm Steve Adicott with Caveon. I'm very pleased to be here today for this month's episode of the Caveon webinar series, where we are going to be taking a closer look at on-site monitoring. Now, really, we've got a couple of goals that we want to accomplish today. First, we want to provide input and support for you districts out there that want to start an on-site monitoring program. We also want to provide some strong best practices for districts and states that may already have a site monitoring program to help you improve or enhance it. So as I said, I'm Steve Adicott. I'm a Senior Vice President here at Caveon. I've been a founder, so I've been here from the beginning 15 years ago. And I work very closely with a number of states and districts in making sure that we're doing everything Caveon can to help protect the integrity of your test programs. And I'm joined by Mark Weinstein. Mark is Vice President of Caveon Investigative Services, which is the part of Caveon that conducts hundreds of site monitorings at schools across the country every spring. In addition to that, Mark is an attorney and serves as Caveon's Chief Privacy Officer. So with that as background, let's keep moving. Here's what we want to cover today. How might a district select schools that will have monitoring conducted? And who should be the folks actually in the schools doing the observations? What kind of qualifications should they have? And what kind of training should be extolled in making sure they do an excellent job while in the schools? And lastly, what kind of data should be captured? How should it be captured? And how can that data be used to help improve the efficacy of your state program? Now, we've covered some of this content just last year. That session was really sort of nuts and bolts site monitoring 101, which was important content, and we're actually, we've got recordings of that session available to you. Probably worth checking out again. It's good material. But really, we want to expand on that based on our experiences in the last year and those of our customers. And I think that just before we dive in, it's probably worth kind of framing what we've got going on here. It is the case that we're continually conducting research and surveys of districts and states, and we're aware that well over 2/3, about 70% of the districts out there do have a formal site monitoring program in place, which is awesome. It's music to our ears. And the other 30% is kind of split almost in half, where either there is no program in place or monitorings are only conducted when there's some sort of unusual situation. Hey, we thought there was a problem, so we wanted to send people in to see what's really going on. And that makes a lot of sense too. But we do want to cover content that will be useful to both groups today. So, planning for monitoring. First, why would we even entertain the idea of instituting a formal site monitoring program? First and foremost, it's all about valid test results. We spend so much time, so much effort, so many dollars designing exams, developing them, administering them, scoring them, reporting the results to the state, to the feds. Let's do what we can to make sure the results really mean what we want them to mean. And while we're doing that, while we're helping ensure validity, we've got a great opportunity from a quality assurance standpoint. Hey, how are the policies and procedures of the district being complied with? How effective is the training the state and districts are giving to the schools around test administrations? What can be improved? And also, hey, are we seeing things? Here's a school that's doing an exemplary job. Well, what is it they're doing? And how can we replicate that? How can we learn from it, bottle it up, and distribute it throughout the rest of the district? So all kinds of good things come from implementing this type of program. And by the way, federal peer review requires it. So those are the reasons we think it makes sense to have a program in place. Now, when it comes to protecting the validity of the scores, what am I really talking about? There are a number of threats with various risks associated with them that can affect the validity of test scores. In K-12, we see things like inappropriate coaching by proctors, things like misapplying of test administration rules around accommodations, pauses, breaks, as well as myriad challenges around electronics, cell phones, social media. These things present threats to valid test scores, and your monitoring program can provide protection against them. Also, site monitoring can provide a very strong psychological deterrence to educators that may be tempted to bend the rules a little bit. Hey, if I know we've got site monitors coming to observe what's going on in my classroom during my testing, well, maybe I'm less inclined to bend those rules a little bit. So how do I decide which schools should be visited? Well, ideally, every school in your district would have 2 site monitors on site. Every day tests are being administered. Unfortunately, we all know that is a fantastical situation. It can't happen. We've got way too many budget constraints, staffing restraints, financial constraints. We can't do it. So let's take a look at what is possible with our existing resources. And ideally, we create a subset of schools for visitation based on some of these bullet points. Maybe last year, something happened. We had a suspicion that something weird occurred. And so we want to have feet on the ground and eyes in the classroom for that particular school. Or maybe based on something like statistical analysis of test data, we've seen that there are aberrant results in a couple of places. Great. We're going to send monitors there. It's also the case that many districts simply take a look, hey, here's all the schools, and based on the resources we've got, we're going to create sort of a random selection of where we're going and when, with the goal of being in every school at least once during this test period. And if we can't do that, then we're going to go every other year. Whatever works. Now, all of this begs a pretty interesting question. I asked my colleague, Mark Weinstein, Mark, should monitoring visits be announced or unannounced? Here's what he had to say.
We recommend that monitoring visits are unannounced for the specific day or days that monitors will actually go to the school. We think it's appropriate to tell the school that monitoring may take place on any day or every day of the testing window, and that monitors may arrive first thing in the morning, or they may arrive after the first testing session has been completed. And the idea here is you want to encourage compliance on every day of the testing window. If you tell the school the specific day that monitors are going to be there, it's possible that the school will only be compliant with testing policies on that day because they knew that monitors would be there on that day. But if you keep them guessing a little bit as to each day, they're more likely to be compliant, and it serves as a deterrent to negligent or bad administration conduct.
I always appreciate Mark's perspective on those important topics. So now I want to talk about who should do the monitoring and what kind of knowledge and skills should be imparted on them before they enter schools in your district. Well, first and foremost, we want folks to conduct monitoring that understand this crazy beast we call large-scale, high-stakes state assessments. So if you have any district assessment staff with availability to conduct monitorings, that's ideal. It is the case that it might not be someone from assessment, but someone else in the district who has familiarity with the whole process. One of the things we do at Caveon, for instance, in the next couple of weeks, we are initiating an engagement where we will be monitoring over 120 schools in about 2.5 weeks in a particular state. And so we recruit retired educators folks that have been in schools, they understand the drill, they understand testing, they know what it's like to be around kids. We do make sure that they are not monitoring in schools where they worked. That's a very important distinction. The other option, there are organizations, Caveon is one of them, that you can look to for independent third-party support around a monitoring program. Now, once you've got the folks, how are you going to coach them up appropriately? Because really, a monitor needs to be prepared to do a number of different things in a day. They need to be capable of communicating effectively with school staff. They need to understand the protocols and checklists the district or the state require for this purpose. And as part of the monitoring, there could be a need to conduct interviews of certain staff and certain roles at the school. They're going to be looking and observing the actual administration in the test center or in the classroom. What should they be looking for? What's usual and appropriate in a test room? And then what's irregular? And if the monitor spots an irregularity, what does he or she do? What is the process and procedure for escalating? Hey, holy smokes, I'm seeing something really strange here. I need to let people know. So that handling of irregularities and escalation is critically important for people to be trained upon. More and more, we're seeing districts move away from pen and paper checklists and tools and actually using software on web-enabled phones or tablets. That requires some orientation and some familiarity for the folks. And then sometimes local statutes, local policies trump the district or the state's policies and procedures. So that sensitivity to local requirements is also very, very important. Now, it can be hard to initiate an entire training protocol on all these topics. There is support available to you. And if anyone would like to find out about that kind of thing, that's something that Caveon has extensive experience in providing. Okay, we've identified who's going to do the monitoring. We've trained them. What is it we're asking them to do in the school? It's really kind of three buckets. One, how well does the school and the school staff comply with requisite policies and procedures? Next, there's a multitude of roles around the administration that are being filled by various staff. How well trained are the folks in each one of those roles? And lastly, how are we measuring the staff and the compliance with these checklists? So it's seeing what's going on, understanding who's performing what role, and gathering information about that in a consistent, rigorous manner. What does a day in the life of a monitor look like? Well, we think it's important that the monitors understand they're going to be on site for hours. The monitors need to be there when the school opens up for the day. The monitors need access to training logs and agreements that have been completed by various roles like proctors. They need to be able to view where sensitive test materials are stored securely. They want to view how proctors and students log into electronic testing systems. And as I said, be in the rooms during testing, unobtrusively, but observing carefully what really is transpiring. And then at the end of the day, be there for final sign-off and wrap-up. Materials back to the secure storage areas, everyone back to business as usual when the day's testing concludes. Really, we're asking monitors to focus on people and process. I already talked about three of these things: our procedures being complied with, our roles being filled appropriately, what's going on in the test environment. Is it usual? Is it typical? Is there something irregular? I haven't talked about monitoring student behaviors. And that is an area that can be very, very telling. Do the kids seem to be behaving in what is typical, usual testing behavior? Or is there something different going on? And my colleague, Mark Weinstein, has seen this up close and personally. So I asked him, Mark, what kinds of things might monitors see while they're in the testing rooms?
What kinds of things might monitors see? One experience comes to mind where we had a monitor in a testing room for a timed state assessment session where the monitor was there when the test administrator initiated the testing session and students had started testing. And they were testing for about 10 or 15 minutes when the test administrator walked up to the monitor and asked the monitor if he knew what time he had started the test. And the monitor looked around the room and noticed there was no clock on the wall, and it appeared that the test administrator was not wearing a watch. So in that case, that was reported up to the school test coordinator, and after that session was completed, a clock was placed on the wall in the room. And by the way, the test administrator also went back to the monitor towards what he thought was the end of the testing session and asked how much time had elapsed. So the test administrator really did not adequately prepare the room for a timed assessment session, and that definitely demonstrated the value of monitoring.
Okay, data. Gathering it, managing it, making decisions, using it, and leveraging data to foment change. Let's talk about gathering data first. When we talk about tools, protocols, and checklists, much of that detail should be binary. Yes, no questions. This is really important because, one, it removes subjectivity from the monitors. Hey, we're all human, and I'm going to likely be, I think I see this. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. But yes, no, it's arbitrary. It also makes it easier to compare data across schools. Now, just as I highlight the importance of having yes, no binary responses, it is the case that sometimes a response, a yes, no response, will require additional detail. So there needs to be the ability for the monitor to submit his or her narrative. Here's what we saw. This is how it appeared to be irregular. This is how it appeared to deviate from standard policies. And then really clear, how are we not just collecting this, but how is that information being archived and stored, whether it's electronic or paper and pencil? That's probably more important for the districts that are using paper and pencil data collection protocols. Now, electronically, there are software tools that are designed specifically for this purpose, to gather very, very detailed information. And I realize this is small, but an electronic checklist will involve things like school and proctor information, test room information, the number of students, the seating arrangements, logins and other procedures, what kind of accommodations may be in play in a particular test room, proctor behaviors, how are electronics being managed per the state's policies, and what I mentioned before, the student behaviors. So here is an example of the use of an electronic tool, and this specific example is around where sensitive test materials might be stored. So, what time did you arrive? Upon arriving at the room, note the room number and other identifiers. Was any person present inside the room? Are there windows? How many doors? Are the doors secured? That level of granularity. Now, another example, what did a proctor do or not do during the testing? For instance, did the proctor use a cell phone? Did the proctor appear to attempt to read any of the test booklets? Were there any sort of hand signals? Was there any sort of inappropriate coaching or prompting of students? That kind of thing that we really want to be aware of if it's going on. So you can imagine if you've got monitors gathering that granularity of detail across the entire district, that's a mountain of data that needs to be managed. And this is really important. There needs to be school level reviews. You know, to my knowledge, did this monitoring go the way it should? Great. District level reviews, yes, we're comfortable with the veracity of the data that's been collected. There needs to be acceptance and rejection protocols. which means there needs to be workflow for reviews, for permissionings, etc. Now, once all that data is collected and archived, we're able to use it. And that's where the monitoring becomes very, very powerful. And really, we're looking at two types of things here. One is nuts and bolts quantitative analysis of the binary questions. The yes-no answers make it easy to pinpoint those schools that appear to require additional training. We can identify areas of test administration that are not yet covered in our existing policies and procedures, but should be. Most importantly, we can identify irregularities or even potential violations that are so significant, hey, they require some sort of follow-up. We need to send folks down here to inquire what's going on. So that quantitative data that pinpoints next steps in appropriate places, all that data can be qualitatively interpreted for different stakeholders, actually for consumption by different stakeholders. So there's probably really important feedback that can go back to the school and the staff of what was observed within their buildings. There's information at a school level, at a district level, certainly at the state level, that could be shared with the media because parents and the public want to know what's going on within the public school system. And then the district needs to be able to prepare information, its interpretations, its analysis of the data for the state. How are we doing? Are we improving? Do we have fewer irregularities or more than last year? And why? And perhaps most importantly, how confident are we in the test scores, in the test score validity, which is why we're here in the first place? So along those lines, I asked Mark, what are some examples of how he has seen monitoring results used most effectively?
Monitoring results can be used on an individual level to help improve the performance of test administrators and proctors, and also school-wide level and really district-wide level to improve training for everyone who participates in the assessment program. So, for example, one observation that monitors have made in observing state assessments is that a test administrator looks at student work on scratch paper during an active testing session, where the test administration manual clearly says test administrators and proctors shall not look at student work. So that information then can be used in a couple of ways. One is for the school to directly counsel the test administrators who are observed looking at student work on scratch paper to make it clear to them individually, directly, that they should not be doing that during a testing session. And also, when it comes to school level and district-wide training, that information can be emphasized. The rule to not look at student work on scratch paper can be emphasized in training, and we've seen that where our monitors have made this observation.
I think those are some excellent ideas. I'm always impressed with Mark's experience and insights on these points. So I want to begin to wrap up. As I said, we wanted to provide some useful information to districts that may be starting up a monitoring program. So just in summary, what's your purpose? What is it you're trying to accomplish here? Let's be really clear in articulating that and having that goal or those goals drive everything we're implementing. Got to figure out how much of the apple we can bite off based upon our resources. And once we've done that, figure out the sites that are going to be visited and who's going to do the visiting. Before we send anybody out, let's make sure they are capably trained to do this work effectively, appropriately. Give them the tools and the training they need. And at the end of the day, at the end of the spring test administration window, let's take a breath and figure out how did we do? What worked and what didn't? Now, that's pretty similar to what we want to say to the districts that already have a program in place with just a couple of tweaks. Since you've got your program in place, you understand the wealth of data and knowledge to be gained through effective monitoring. But let's recognize that's just one data source among several other important ones too. But when we combine all these data points, all these data sources together, boy, we can get some pretty clear illumination of what seems to be working, what isn't, where it's working, where it isn't, across schools and throughout the district. We're able to use the data that's collected and inform appropriate staff in the schools on the front line, working to help these kids do the best they can. It is the case that sometimes an itch may be identified, something so unusual, so anomalous, so irregular, that itch must be scratched, and we're going to send in the right folks to understand what really happened to cause that sort of an irregularity. Use the information for planning next year, and again, how can we get better? Let's evaluate what's working, how well, why, and maximize that. So we really appreciate the chance to share our experiences with you. We hope you have found this helpful, and maybe one little nugget, maybe two, will help improve your program to help better ensure the validity of test scores this spring. We're going to take some questions if there are any. I see that the first one involves, how do you balance keeping electronics out of the testing area with using software to collect the data? Do you feel that this provides additional security risk? That is an excellent question. And we've seen where a district or a state that has a very strong zero electronics rule has altered that because they weighed out the benefits, the operational, the workflow, the reporting benefits of having this data collected electronically versus paper and pencil against the risk of misuse of that tablet in the classroom. And so that kind of comes back to who is it that's doing the monitoring, how well trained are they, how well trusted might they be. And risk, of course, involves the likelihood of something happening and the impact. So in that case, the likelihood of an independent, non-school employee misusing the electronic, maybe the likelihood is low. The impact sure could be high, but that's an individual district or state decision to be made. Are there other questions?
I can see we have another that says, are there any specific suggestions you have for monitoring students with special needs accommodations?
So that's another good question. We know that from our experience that those are testing sessions that can be concerning and troubling because of the nature of the situation and trying to give the appropriate level of support versus what could be an inappropriate level of support. Specific suggestions, what are the policies and procedures? How does the training address that? And at the end of the test administration, a review. How well did this work? Have we identified any concerns? Have we been able to monitor appropriately? For sure, we want to try to look at all the administrations within a building, but if there are special accommodations scheduled, it might make sense to make sure the monitors are on that day and taking a look at what's happening there too. Other questions, Tristan?
Yeah, so we have a few more, but we'll just take one more live and then we'll send out the answers to any that we don't get to today. So this last one says, how do you ensure continued compliance at your audited test centers once they receive training and recommendations?
So it depends on resources. I think if you've been there and you've felt that the administration or the staff at a particular school have done an adequate job, that might be your only chance to see what's going on in those walls this test season. But we feel it's very important that just because someone passed last year, they need to be visited this year. And that gets back to the scheduling piece. So great job last year. We want to commend them. Let's laud them and applaud. But then let's make sure that things are going as well this year by ensuring that school is visited during this spring's administration. I see that there's also one question. We need to wrap up, but can you share the specific software used to obtain the monitor questions? Caveon has developed a software tool for this purpose called Caveon Core. You can learn about Caveon Core on our website, but we'll also make sure that in the wrap up, anyone who wants details on that system gets access to it. Thank you all. Really appreciate you taking time out of what I know is a busy school season to sit with us, and we hope this is helpful. Have a great day.